My name is Logan Wooton. Today I'm going to be talking about our research project, the rampant exploitation of women and the rise of the sex trade in Beijing, China. For my first source, I'm going to talk about the government crackdown of the sex work in China, responses from female sex workers and the implications of their health, written by Huang and Su Ming. I'm going to be talking about the Beijing section of this paper. This paper talks about the government's crackdown on the sex trade and the unintended consequences that came along from that, both for the government and for the health organizations. For the government, this caused the sex trade to be driven underground, making it harder to root out and to put a stop to. For health organizations, it rolled back many efforts put in place to prevent the spread of STDs and HIV. This crackdown on sex trade led to a decrease in access to medical care and increased the risk of HIV. Conclusion: improper handling of the situation by the government has led to an increase in HIV and STDs throughout the country. For my next source, I'm going to talk about HIV, sex work, and civil society in China, written by Kaufman. In this paper, she talks about specifically the Strike Hard campaign taking place in 2010. The Strike Hard campaign is a recurring campaign taken nationwide to stomp out crime throughout the country. However, I'm going to be specifically talking about sex trade here. In this Strike Hard campaign, specifically in Beijing, venues were regularly raided just for suspected involvement in the sex trade. People were regularly detained for suspected involvement in the sex trade. It led to a great paranoia and great fear amongst the sex trade, driving it further underground, limiting resources and access to these resources. On the graph here, we can see the rise in the years going forth from 2010 and the rise up in HIV and STDs, well, specifically HIV and AIDS. For my last source, I'm talking about reaching and identifying the STD HIV risk of sex workers in Beijing. This was written by Rogers and Co. This paper, they would go through and interview sex workers in Beijing specifically. The first of their many challenges was actually finding people to interview. Numerous factors made this a difficulty. The first is fear. Sex workers tend to avoid strangers and outsiders and anyone they perceive as a threat. There's a fear of arrest, fear of harassment, both from the police and from locals, and fear of raids on their places of employment. There's also a very negative stigma on sex trade. Speaking to these researchers could open them up to exposure to both their families, their friends, and to their places of employment. Alternatively, sex workers often are very hidden and very mobile, moving around every few months to stay ahead of police due to paranoia and the harsh treatment they face. Because of this, workers often have trouble finding assistance, but that's both reliable and consistent throughout China, which has led to a spread of STDs and HIV. They also have many roadblocks when it comes on the front of STD and HIV. Specifically, there's a lack of access to education about such. In the paper, there is a percentage that is provided. 74% of interviewees have had a checkup in 2002, where of those, only 10% got information about STDs, which has led to a great reliance on both peers and non-government organizations for assistance of help and information. This is due to legality. Outreach programs often find it very hard to get in contact and are both limited in scope and ability. As stated earlier, there's also the social stigma. Fear of judgment leads to avoidance of clinics and such, and a fear of legal consequences has led to avoidance of anyone that they determine could potentially put them at risk. And finally, there's the legality of the situation. Prostitution is a crime, and as such, workers are often secretive, which makes it very difficult to acquire preventative measures and other such helpful aid. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cole, and today I'm presenting my three sources regarding women and the sex trade in Beijing, China. My first source, Prostitution and Female Trafficking in China, Between Phenomena and Discourse by Bonnie Ling, refers to the amendment and establishment of new laws that China attempted to create, stopping the sex trade. Doing this established roadblocks, creating new issues such as the sex trade becoming quieter and more private, leading it to be an underground problem. This is where China tried to follow Sweden en route of making the sex trade fully illegal and unsuccessfully pushed it underground. In Ling's article, she mentions a woman named Wang Jiqi, who in her case was convicted of trafficking and working within the sex trade. In Wang's In her brothels, she had 500 women who were working under false jobs, and she threatened them with violence, pushing them into prostitution. My second source, by Aurora Dios, revisiting the trafficking of women, challenges since Beijing, focuses on the World Conference on Women and the BPFA, or the Beijing Platform for Action. The World Conference on Women is a massive meeting where many figures meet and they speak on rights and problems that women face throughout the entire world. This leads to reformative ideas and the laws that aid women in these problems. The Beijing Platform for Action, or the BPFA, ensures that human rights and women's rights are considered and validated when these new laws and legislation are created regarding sex trafficking and the trade. My third source, by Zhang Huangbo, Trafficking Women in China, refers to the Chinese government making attempts for new laws to stop the trafficking. These laws focus on restricting and prohibiting the trade, but this leads to barriers being created within their legislation. The main barrier is the protection of these traffickers by townsfolk. This is due to culture, because many women in China are pushed into arranged marriages, and through the trade, women are bought and pushed into these arranged marriages by fathers. The second barrier is culture shock that many women face when they escape the trade. Many women are pushed to enter programs and rehabilitation places in which they attempt to reintroduce them to society and things that have changed since they were a prostitute or a part of prostitution. Within this, many women fall through and end up going back because they don't know anything else. And their unfamiliarity with the true world and the normal world creates many problems with the rehabilitation programs specifically.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Jackson, and today I'll be presenting 3 sources that examine prostitution, state control, and human trafficking in China. Together, these works highlight how policy, social conditions, and enforcement strategies shape the experience and vulnerabilities of sex workers and trafficked individuals. Starting with the first source, it is titled State Control, Female Prostitution, and HIV Prevention in China. In this article, Choi analyzes how the Chinese state's approach to regulating prostitution has shifted in response to rising concerns about HIV and AIDS. He draws on interviews with 245 female sex workers conducted between 2003 and 2007. Choi argues that the dominant narrative has changed. Instead of viewing sex workers as victims in need of protection, the state increasingly portrays them as potential victimizers who may spread HIV. This shift has led to intensified police crackdowns and stricter regulation. However, he shows that these repressive measures actually undermine public health goals. When sex workers fear arrest, they are less able to negotiate safe sex practices, have limited access to preventive resources, and face heightened risk of HIV exposure. Ultimately, Choi concludes that punitive enforcement creates more vulnerability, not safety. This article is important because it highlights the complex intersection between state policy, public health interventions, and the lived experiences of sex workers in post-socialist China. This picture here shows the progression of HIV in China. This first picture is 1985, and then this is how much it has spread by 1998. For my next source is titled Combating Human Trafficking in East Asia. The second source is a policy commentary by Trevino, who examines human trafficking across East Asia. He argues that even though many East Asian countries have signed global and regional anti-trafficking agreements, enforcement is still inconsistent and often ineffective. He emphasizes that there are major gaps between governments' stated commitments and their actual ability to protect victims. He explains that organized crime networks and patterns of migration play a major role in sustaining human trafficking, especially among vulnerable women. He also points out that socioeconomic inequality and migration pressures push people, particularly migrant workers and women, into positions where they are easily exploited. Overall, his work highlights how enforcement failures, weak victim protections, and unequal social conditions allow trafficking systems to persist in the region. And for my third slide, is titled Prostitution and Social Control in Contemporary China. The final article by Vincent Gill and colleagues takes a closer look at prostitution in China during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Using more than 2,000 prostitution cases from 13 Chinese prison facilities, combined with extensive interviews, the authors classify different types of sex workers and analyze the broader social forces behind the industry's rapid expansion. They argue that economic reforms, internal migration, the decline of state-provided welfare, and shifting cultural attitudes contributed to a growing sex industry. Gill and his co-authors also examined the state's legal and administrative responses, including the use of re-education and forced labor programs. Their work shows that prostitution in China cannot be understood without considering the social and economic reconstruction that followed marketing reforms. This picture shows how China's prostitution industry has grown to be much larger than others. Revenue is up to $73 billion. And taking all these sources together demonstrates how state policies, economic change, and social inequalities influence the lives of sex workers and trafficked individuals in China. They show that punitive or overly repressive approaches often increase vulnerability rather than reducing harm. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for developing more effective and humane policies. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marisol Villegas, and I will be talking about the 3 annotations that I did for this project. For the first one, I did the profile of HIV risk factors in the context of sex work environments among migrant female sex workers in Beijing, China. In this paper, they examined 348 migrant female sex workers working in different sex environments across Beijing, which is street-based, massage parlors, and entertainment venues. They found that rural migrant women face the highest level of exploitation, including police harassment, inconsistent income, and unsafe working conditions. They showed that low-tier street-based sex workers experience greater violence, fewer resources, and significantly higher health risks than women in indoor venues. They demonstrate how urbanization and rural to urban migration create a vulnerable female underclass, directly fueling the growth of Beijing's sex trade. And now the next slide, which is called Mass Media and HIV/AIDS Prevention Among Female Sex Workers in Beijing, China, which is produced by Zhao and other colleagues on the paper. They analyzed how Beijing female sex workers receive HIV or transmitted sexual diseases information through TV, posters, the internet, and social media. They found that greater media exposure increases condom use confidence and leads to safer sex practices among women in the trade. And now this is a lead example of an example on the poster that is in Beijing, China for the sex workers. They identified a major gap between low income and hidden location sex workers that lack access to accurate health information, increasing exploitation and risk. This shows that unequal access to education and media contributes to health-based vulnerability among women in the Beijing sex industry. And now the last slide is called Methods Used to Find Clients and Risky Sexual Behavior Among Female Sex Workers in China, who is produced by Lian and other colleagues on the paper. They investigate how sex workers across urban China, including Beijing, use smartphones, apps, and online platforms to find clients. They show that digital tools create new opportunities but also risk covert risk, unsafe client encounters, and reduced oversight. This links the rise of online clients seeking to broader forces such as urbanization, economic inequality, and police crackdowns. This highlights how technology has transformed the sex trade, making it more hidden, fast-moving, and exploitive, especially for migrant women. And this is an example on where mostly sex workers are and how it's unsafe for them. Thank you. And for the last slide, last but not least slide, we love you, Dr. Control. Follow him by Lancer Pop. Thank you.